Hello, I'm live. I hope the connection is better today than it was when I started recording chapter 19 of Travels with my Aunt. I had constant interruption, so I didn't get very far with that chapter. This is the story about Henry Pulling, who is a retired bank manager, who met his Aunt Augusta after 50 years at his mother's funeral. She's a traveller, Henry is not. And they have been to Paris and Istanbul and Boulogne to check out Henry's father's grave. And I'm continuing now. He is back, but his aunt is not back yet. A month passed and no news came to me from my aunt. There was never... I had an interruption again. I rang several times, but there was never any reply. I tried to interest myself in a novel of Thackeray, but it lacked the immediacy of my... I tried to interest myself in a novel of Thackeray's, but it lacked the immediacy of my aunt's stories. As she had foreseen, I even regretted having prevented her telling me the story of Charles Potiphar. I found myself living now when I lay awake or waited in the kitchen for the kettle to boil, or when I let the newcomes fall shut on my lap with memories of Couronne, Monsieur d'Ambreuse and Mr. They peopled my loneliness. When 6 weeks went by without news, I became anxious, in case, like my father, she had died in a foreign land. I even telephoned to the St. James and Albany. It was the first time since I left the bank that I had telephoned abroad. I was nervous of my poor French when I spoke into a receiver, as though the errors might be magnified by the microphone. The receptionist told me that my aunt was no longer there. She had left 3 weeks before for Cherbourg. Cherbourg? The boat train, the receptionist said, and the line was cut before I could ask him. What boat? I feared then that my aunt had left me for good. She had come into my life only to disturb it. I had lost the taste for dahlias. When weeds swarmed up, I was tempted to let them grow. Once I even consented as a possible relief to my aunt to attend on Major Charge's invitation a political meeting. It turned out to be a meeting of British Empire loyalists, and I supposed then that it was Major Charge who had given the organisation my address for their pamphlets. I saw several of my old clients there, including the Admiral, and I was glad for the first time that I was in retirement. A bank manager is not expected to have strong political preferences, particularly eccentric ones, and how quickly the gossip of my presence would have gone around Southwood. Now, if my old clients looked at me at all, it was with a puzzled expression, as though they were uncertain when it was we had met and on what occasion. Like a waiter on his day off, I passed virtually unrecognized. It was an odd feeling for one who had been so much in the centre of Southwood life. As I went upstairs to bed, I felt myself to be a ghost returning home, transparent as water. Couronne was more alive than I was. I was most surprised to see that my image was visible in the glass. Perhaps existence, the reality of my existence, that I began a letter to Miss Keene. I made several drafts before I was satisfied with what I wrote, and the letter I'm copying now differs in small details from the one I dispatched. My dear Miss Keene, I can read it in the draft, but I cut out the "my" in the final version, for it seemed to presume an intimacy which she had never acknowledged and which I had never claimed. Dear Miss Keene, I'm truly distressed that you don't feel properly settled yet in your new home at Coffee Fontaine. Though, of course, I cannot help feeling. I altered the I to a we in later drafts. That your thoughts still rest sometimes on our quiet life here in Southwood. I have never known so good a friend as your father, and my thoughts often go back to those pleasant evenings when Sir Alfred sat under the Vandervelde dispensing hospitality, and you sat sewing while he and I finished the wine. That last phrase I cut from the next draft. There was too much emotion in it, barely concealed. I have been leading last month, much of it in the company of my aunt, of whom I wrote to you. We have even gone as far afield together as Istanbul, where I was a good deal disappointed with the famed Santa Sophia. I can say to you, as I couldn't say to my aunt, that I much prefer our own St. John's Church for a religious atmosphere, and I'm glad that the vicar doesn't feel it necessary to summon the faithful to prayer by a gramophone record in the minaret. At the beginning of October we paid a visit together to my father's grave. I don't think I ever told you. Indeed, I only learned of it recently myself, that he died and was buried in Boulogne, with a strange concentration of circumstances too long to write about. Concatenation of circumstances too long to write here. How I wish you were in Southwood, that I might tell you of them. That sentence, too, I thought it prudent to eliminate. I'm reading the Newcomes at the moment, but I don't enjoy it as I enjoyed Esmond. Antic in me. I opened Palgrave, too, from time to time, and read over my old favourites. I went on with a sense of hypocrisy. My books are a good antidote to foreign travel and reinforce the sense of the England I love. But sometimes I wonder whether that England exists still beyond my garden hedge, or further than Church Road. Then I think how much harder it must be for you, in Coffee Fontaine, to keep the taste of the past. The future here seems to me to have no taste at all. It is like a meal on a menu which serves only to kill the appetite. If you ever come back to England... But that was a sentence I never finished, and I can't remember now what I intended to write. Christmas approached with no news of my aunt, not even by the medium of a Christmas card. A card, of course, arrived from Coffee Fontaine, a rather unlikely card with an old church seen across an acre of snow, showed goldfish from Major Charge, which showed goldfish in a bowl being fed by Father Christmas. It was delivered by hand to save the stamp. The local store sent me a tear-off calendar with a different treasure of British art for each month, the colours bright and shiny as though they had been washed in Omo. And on the 23rd of December the postman brought a large envelope, which when I opened it at breakfast shed a lot of silvery tinsel into my plate, so that I couldn't finish normally. The tinsel came from an Eiffel Tower, which Father Christmas was climbing with his sack over his shoulder. Under the printed Meilleurs Vœux was only one name written in block capitals: Wordsworth. He must have seen my aunt in Paris, for how else could he have obtained my address? At the bank I had always used the official Christmas cards to send to my best clients, with the bank's coat of arms stamped on the cover, and inside a picture of the main office in Cheapside, or a photograph of the board of directors. Now that I had retired, there were few people to whom I posted cards. Miss Keene, of course, Major Charge, perforce. I sent one also to my dentist, to the vicar of St. John's, and my former chief cashier, who had become manager at a branch in Nottingham. A year before my mother had come to me for Christmas dinner, and without the aid of chicken, I had cooked a turkey quite successfully under her directions. Then we had sat almost silent like strangers in a restaurant car, both of us feeling that we had eaten too much until she left at 10. Afterwards I had, as was my habit, attended the midnight service with carols at St. John's. This year, since I had no wish to cook a meal for myself alone, I booked a table for dinner at the Abbey restaurant off Latimer Road. It proved a mistake. I had not realized they were mounting a special menu with turkey and plum pudding in it to attract the lonely and the Southwood. Before I left home, I had rung my aunt's number in a vain hope that she might have returned just in time for Christmas. But the bell tolled and tolled in the empty flat, and I could imagine the noise setting all the Venetian glasses tinkle. The first person I saw when I came into the restaurant, which was a very small one, with heavy beams and stained glass windows and a piece of mistletoe in an undangerous position over the toilet, was the Admiral, sitting all alone. He had obviously dined early and wore a scarlet paper crown. A torn cracker lay on his plate with the remains of plum pudding. I bowed to him and he said angrily, over what looked like a political pamphlet. "I'm pulling," I said. "Pulling? Late of the bank." There was an angry flush below the red paper hat, and an empty bottle of Chianti stood on the table. I added, "Happy Christmas, Admiral." "Good God, man," he said, "haven't you read the news?" I managed to get by, though the channel between the tables was very narrow, and I found to my distress that my table had been reserved next to Major Charges. "Good evening, Major," I said. I began to wonder whether I was the only civilian in the place. "I have a favour to ask of you, Mr. Major Charges. I'm afraid I no longer keep up with the stock market." "Who's talking about the stock market?" "You don't suppose I have anything to do with the city? They've sold this country down the river. I'm talking about my fish." Miss Truman interrupted us to take my order. Perhaps to encourage her customers, she was wearing a paper cap, vaguely military in shape, but yellow in colour. She was a large, boisterous woman who liked to be called Peter. The little restaurant had always seemed too small to contain her, and her partner as well, a woman named Nancy, who was timid and retiring, and perhaps for that reason showed herself only occasionally, framed at the service hatch. Unable to look elsewhere, I made some complimentary reference to her cap. "Like the old days," she said, looking, but that she had been an officer in the Women's Navy. How ambiguous my feelings were. I realized in those moments how deep was the disturbance my aunt had caused. This was my familiar world, the little local world of aging people to which Miss Greene longed to return, where one read of danger only in the newspapers, and the deepest change to be expected was a change of government, and the biggest scandal I could remember who had lost too much money at the Earl's Court greyhound track. It was more my country than England could be, for I had never seen the Satanic Mills or visited the northern wastes, and in my way I had been happy here, yet I was looking at Peter, Miss Truman, with an ironic eye, as though I had borrowed my aunt's vision and saw with her eyes. Beyond Latimer Road there stretched another world, the world of Wordsworth and Couron and Monsieur d'Ambrose and Colonel Harkham, and the mysterious Mr. Visconti, who had dressed up as a Monsignor to escape the Allied troops. Yes, and of my father too, saying "Dolly, darling," to Miss Patterson on the auberge floor, and gaining a lifelong devotion by dying in her arms. To whom now could I apply for a visa to that land, with my aunt gone? "Will you take the set meal, Mr. Pulling?" "I don't think I can manage the plum pudding. Nancy has made some smashing mince." Miss Truman rolled away with a Tom Bowling stride, and I turned to Major Charge. "You were saying?" "I'm going away for the New Year to a study group at Chesham. I've got to board my fish. Can't trust them with a daily. I thought of Peter, but she's a woman too in a way. You can see how she feeds us. any excuse to pile it on. She would probably do the same with the little buggers. You want me to look after your fish? I looked after your dahlias, but I had to say, yes, of course I will. I'll bring you the food, just 1 teaspoon once a day. Don't pay any attention if they come guzzling at the glass. They don't know what's good for them. I'll harden my heart, I said. I waved away the turtle soup. It was over-familiar. Too often I had opened a bottle of it. When I had no appetite even for eggs, I asked, what kind of a study group? The problems of empire, he replied, staring at me with eyes enlarged and angry, as though I had already made some foolish or unsympathetic reply. I thought we'd got rid of all those. A temporary failure of nerve, he snapped, and bayoneted his turkey. I could certainly have preferred him as a client to Quran. He would never have bothered me about overdrafts. He lived carefully within the limits of his pension. He was an honest man, even if I found his ideas repulsive. And then I thought of Mr. Visconti, dancing with my behind the Messaggero after swindling the Vatican and the King of Saudi Arabia and leaving a wide trail of damage behind him in the banks of Italy. Was the secret of lasting youth known only to the criminal mind? A man's been looking for you, Major Charles said, after a long silence. The Admiral got up from his table and made unsteadily for the door. He was still wearing his paper crown, but when his fingers were already on the handle, he remembered it and squashed it into a ball. What man? He'd gone to the post office at the bottom of Southwood Road. What did he want? He didn't tell me. He rang and knocked and rang and knocked, making the hell of a din. Even the fish were scared, poor little buggers. There were 2 of them. I thought I ought to speak to them before they disturbed the whole street. I don't know at that moment of Wordsworth, a possible message from my aunt. Was he black, I asked. Black? What an extraordinary question. Of course he wasn't. He didn't give a name. Neither of them did. He asked where he could find you, but I had no idea you were planning to come here. You weren't here last year or the year before. I don't think I've ever seen you here before. All I could tell him was that I knew you went to the carol service at St. John's. I wonder who he is, I said. I had a deep conviction I was about to find myself again in Aunt Augusta's world, and my pulse beat with an irrational sense of pleasure. When Miss Truman brought me 2 mince pies, I accepted them both, as though I needed them to sustain me for a long voyage. I even helped Mandy butter. I used real Remy Martin, Miss Truman said. You haven't pulled your cracker. Pull it with me, Peter, I said, with daring. She had a strong wrist, but I got the winning end, and a small plastic object rolled onto the floor. I was glad to see that it was not a hat. Major Charge leapt at it and gave a snort of laughter as merciless as a nose blowing. He put it to his mouth and breathed hard, making a sound like a raspberry. Then I saw it was shaped like a tiny paw with a whistle in the handle. Lower deck humour, Miss Truman said, in a kindly way. It's the festive season, Major Charge said. He blew another raspberry. Hark, the herald angels sing, he said, in a tone of savagery, as though he were taking some kind of revenge on Christmas Eve, and all its impedimenta of holy families and managers and wise men, a revenge on love, a revenge for some deep disappointment. John's Church by a quarter. I arrived at St. John's Church by 11:15. The service always began at 11:30, so as to distinguish it from the Roman Catholic midnight mass. I had begun to attend when I first became the bank manager, for it gave me a stable family air if I were seen at the service, and though, unlike Aunt Augusta, I have no religious convictions, I could be there without hypocrisy, since I have always enjoyed the more poetic aspects of Christianity. Christmas, it seems to me, is a necessary festival. We require a season when we can regret all the flaws in our human failures, sad but consoling. For years now, I have always sat in the same pew, below a stained glass window which was dedicated in 1887 to the memory of Councillor Trumbull. It shows Christ surrounded by children as he sits in the shade of a very green tree. The text, of course, is "Suffer little children." Councillor Trumbull was responsible for building the square red brick block with barred windows in Cranmer Road, which, once an orphanage, is now a detention centre for juveniles. The service began with the angels sing, "Hark the herald angels sing," and then we proceeded to the old favourite, "Good King Wenceslas." Deep and crisp and even, the high female voices sang from the gallery. It has always seemed to me a very beautiful line, conveying the landscape of a small country England, with no crowds, no traffic to soil the snow, when even the royal palace stood among the silent and What on earth are you doing here? If you can spare me a moment after the service, sir, he replied, and raising his prayer book he sang in a very fine baritone voice, "Though the frost was cruel when a poor man hove in sight." Perhaps Detective Sergeant Sparrow, like Miss Truman, had once been in the Navy, gathering winter fuel. I looked back at his companion, eagle-faced. He wore a dark grey overcoat and carried an umbrella, crooked for safety, over his arm. I wondered what he would do with it, or with a sharp crease to his trousers, when the time came for him to kneel. He didn't seem as much at home in the church as Detective Sergeant Sparrow. He was not singing and praying. "Mark my footsteps, good my page," the sergeant sang lustily. "Tread thou in them boldly." And the voices in the gallery rose ardently to the unexpected competition from below. At last the proper service began, and I was glad when the Athanasian Creed, which they invariably inflict on us at Christmas, was safely over. As also there are not 3 incomprehensibles, nor 3 uncreated, but 1 uncreated and 1 incomprehensible. Sergeant Sparrow coughed several times in the course of it. I intended, it is always my custom at Christmas, the Anglican Church is service, and I had as much right to commemorate a beautiful legend as any true believer has. The vicar was saying clearly, while the congregation buzzed ambiguously to disguise the fact that they had forgotten the words, "We acknowledge and bewail our manifold sins and wickedness, which we, from time to time, have committed." I noticed that the detective sergeant, perhaps from professional prudence, did not join in this plea of guilty. "We do earnestly repent and are heartily sorry for these our misdoings." I had never before noticed how the prayer sounded like the words of an old lag addressing the bench with a plea for mercy. The presence of Detective Sergeant Sparrow seemed to alter the whole. When I saw argumentative whispers in the pew behind me, and the words, "You, Sparrow," spoken very forcibly, so that I was not surprised when I saw that it was Detective Sergeant Sparrow who knelt as my neighbour at the communion rail. Perhaps they had been uncertain whether I might not take advantage of the communion to escape through a side door. When his turn with the chalice came, Detective Sergeant Sparrow took a very long swig, and I noticed afterwards that more wine had to be fetched before the communion was finished. When I returned to my seat, the detective sergeant trod on my heels, and in the pew behind me the whispers broke out like agonizing for his performance with a chalice. At the end of the service, they stood and waited for me at the church door, and Sergeant Sparrows introduced his companion. "Detective Inspector Woodrow," he said. "Mr. Pulling," he added with an awe in a lower voice. "Inspector Woodrow belongs to the special branch." I shook hands after a little hesitation on both sides. We were wondering, sir, if you wouldn't mind assisting us again, Sergeant Sparrow said. I told Inspector Woodrow of pot. I suppose you are referring to my mother's urn, I replied, with as much coldness I could muster on Christmas morning. On either side. I saw the Admiral go by. In his breast pocket he had a patch of scarlet, which I suppose was the paper cap served as a handkerchief. They told us at the Crown and Anchor, Inspector Woodrow said to me in a stiff, unfriendly tone, that you have your aunt's keys. We like to do things nice. Have I the pleasure of meeting 2 new parishioners? I think I'm going to finish this in a minute. A happy Christmas, Mr. Pulling. The vicar put his hand on my shoulders. Have I the pleasure of meeting 2 new parishioners? Mr. Sparrow, Mr. Woodrow, the vicar, I said. I hope you all enjoyed our carol service. Indeed I did, Sergeant Sparrow said heartily. If there's one thing I like, it's a good tune with words I can understand. Just a moment, quite a bumper. Well, I've decided to stop this here because I keep being interrupted. And I don't want to have to do it again. So, there'll be 3 readings of chapter 19. There's a little bit more to go. Today is the 19th of January.